Hey everybody, it's Nick here again for Grayscale Gorilla. I am the Gorilla, and in this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys the new subsurface scattering that's included in version 13 of Cinema 4D. Now, Cinema's always, for a long time, had a subsurface scattering algorithm, but this new one works a lot differently and produces, I think, much better results and is a little bit kind of easier to use. So let's jump in and learn all about the new subsurface scattering. So I have this model here. It's this kind of dragon, and you may have seen this around. It's just a good kind of model to show off subsurface scattering. There's thin and thick parts kind of all the way through this model, and it'll give us a good idea of what subsurface scattering does and what it is and what the settings do and how they affect things. So let's set up a quick scene so we can start to go through subsurface scattering and talk about what the heck it is. So I'm going to build a really quick studio here using the my Grayscale Gorilla Light Kit Pro. I'm just going to go to Studios and pick a kind of an L-shaped studio here. Just give him something to stand on. And then I think it just needs a softbox. And what you need for subsurface scattering is kind of or what shows off subsurface scattering is kind of a rear light source. So let's just start with like a rim light here kind of in the back. And we could adjust it and maybe move it a little closer. And we could just move our softbox kind of null up a little bit just so it's aiming more in the center. And that should do it for now. So let's do a quick render. You can see what we have is the light kind of hitting the back edge of our dragon here and lighting the floor. And one last thing I think we'll do is just darken the floor a little bit just to kind of keep our focus on the object and not the floor. So there we go. So we have this kind of backlit dragon, and there's just nothing going on. It's really kind of a flat light, and there's just no light going through the object. And a lot of times these kind of dragons, or let's just call it any shape, you know, if you want it to look more like a porcelain kind of shape, or you want it to look more like marble or something small, if you look at a lot of small objects that are made from these kind of natural materials, light doesn't just hit the edge of it and then not go anywhere. It doesn't just hit the edge like you know, like a rock or something. And even rocks have a little like kind of luminance to them sometimes, where if you imagine a piece of amber, you know, if you're looking at you know, you're thinking Jurassic Park and you're thinking of amber, and the light hits it and the light goes through the object, that's what subsurface scattering is there to emulate. So let's make a new material. Let's stop talking about it and actually add a new material to our dragon, and or your whatever shape you're using, and let's go into the luminance channel and add subsurface scattering. Now, luminance is where you want to add subsurface scattering. You want to turn on luminance. You want to go into texture, go to effects, go to subsurface scattering, and let's just do a render as is. And you can see it starts to chug along, and now what we have is this kind of luminescent-ness to our object now. And you can see the light isn't just hitting the edge and stopping, it's kind of starting to go through the object, and that's what we're trying to do here. So first thing I'll mention is if you have the physical renderer. Now the new subsurface scattering is in 13 right now, and it does work with the standard renderer, just like you saw. You hit render and we go. So the first thing to keep in mind is if you have the physical render, if you've seen a previous video of mine, you'll know that the physical render actually renders this quicker than the standard render. And I think it's about the amount of time it takes to calculate it. So we'll get into that a little bit later. We're going to try to dive into a lot of these settings here and worry about what to tweak when you're playing with subsurface scattering. So just for at least tutorial purposes, I'm going to switch over to the physical render because we're going to get a quicker result. I'm also going to go into our render settings, into physical, and change this from adaptive to progressive. And what progressive does is give us a very quick result and then kind of refine it over time. And hopefully this will be at least a little easier to follow along. So let's get into the subsurface scattering shader and talk about what all this stuff does. First of all, first of all, there are presets. So we can actually go pick a preset. Here's an Apple preset. We can see we get different colors, different results, and this may be a good place to start to play around and maybe dial in your look. But what I wanted to do was kind of start from scratch and talk about what all these things do so you can really dive in and adjust it for your situation. So the first thing here is colors. Now, if we pick something like a pink, then you're going to see our object is going to be kind of made out of this pink material, this pink kind of waxy material, right? This is kind of your main color shader. You'll notice that the color of in the color shader here doesn't do much. If you're using a lot of subsurface scattering, you can kind of move this around a lot. You know, we can make this really blue, and it's not going to adjust our model too much. And that's halfway because we don't have lights on it. So if we go to the side that has lights on it, you're going to see it's much more blue. And of course, the light that goes through it, if we go on the back side, is going to be much more pink because that's what our luminance is on. So that's something to keep in mind. This luminance overall color is going to define your object if you're using a lot of subsurface scattering. So our color, let's just make this a middle gray, or let's even turn it off for now and just concentrate on subsurface scattering so we can see what's going on. So back in the shader, we have our color, our overall color, so we can make this whatever color we want. Hit render, and it's going to render this orange or whatever. One more thing we could do is turn up subsurface scattering. And this is more to really show the differences between these settings. So I'm just basically doubling the formula here by adding 200% to the strength. And that's mainly so we could see what's going on. So now what you're seeing is we have this really kind of waxy orange material on our object, and that's defined by this color here, and we're doubling the strength of it. Let's go now to the path length, and this is where it gets interesting for me. The path length is how far the lighting goes into the object. So right now it's set to 10 centimeters. Let's set this to 5 and do a render. And now you're going to see it doesn't penetrate as deep into the object as it did before. You can see now we have kind of dark edges on this side of our dragon, and you can see it's kind of coming through the mouth area. And this is why this model works really well to show you. You can see the light is coming through these horns. It is coming through these little scales here. It's coming through the mouth area, even the little bit smallest part of the tail. But in areas where it's too thicker than this 5 centimeters here, it's actually not going through all the way. And this is where subsurface scattering can get really interesting results. You know, even if we just, again, maybe add a little bit more so we could really show the difference between these. Now you're seeing very, very bright spots here and then really dark areas. So if we keep adjusting the path length down, let's go to 1 centimeter and hit render. You'll notice one thing is it takes longer to calculate. The lower that path length setting is, the more kind of samples the subsurface scattering has to make in order to render. And the lower that goes, the higher your render times. And what's interesting is it's not just a higher render time. It's not really a higher render time at render time. It's actually just the calculating of it takes a long time. So let's keep this at 1 centimeter. Let's hit go. And if you notice down here, it's saying calculating subsurface irradiance. And this is chugging and building the samples. And now it finally renders. Again, and if we move this up back to 10, where we started from, and we hit render, you're going to notice it renders pretty much right away. Right? So that's something to keep in mind. The lower this is, the higher the samples. But in a lot of cases, you do want this low. You don't want the light to pass all the way through. You just want it on the edge. So what happens if you want it really low and you want to speed that up? First of all, let me just show you while we're here the difference between the physical and the standard renderer with the subsurface scattering really low, this calculating. I just switched it to the standard render, and let's hit render and wait and wait and wait. And you'll notice we're at 4, 5, 6 seconds. We're still calculating these samples for the path length. And it's something I ran across, that the subsurface scattering in particular renders much faster with the physical render, and it's primarily this caching that is taking the longest amount of time. You can see we're still caching. We're at 25, 26, 27 seconds, and we're still caching the result for our 1 centimeter length for the standard render. And man, I don't even know how much longer I could talk here to wait for it. So let's talk about what we could do to speed this up, because it does take a long time with the physical renderer as well. So if you open up our path length, we'll actually get to this in a minute. Let's talk about speeding this up, because we need to make this much faster so we could start tweaking other things. If we go into advanced, there are only a few sliders that you have to be concerned with in here in order to speed things up. The first one is the sample density. So if we turn this way down, I'm going to turn it to, I tried to turn it to 5, but it didn't even let me. We're going to go to 10%, and then we're going to hit render, and we're still using the standard render, and you can see it rendered much faster that time. And it's not chugging along, and now the whole render's finished at 7 seconds. But you see we have issues. We have low samples, and that means we have this really blotchy, splotchy kind of thing going on. If we zoom in here, I think you'll be able to see it even more. So it basically didn't calculate as many samples. Instead of 100% density, it only calculated 10%, and now you're seeing the result. We're getting these really blotchy kind of samples here. So one way to do this is we could turn up our sample density. We could turn it up to 20. We're going to get a slightly longer render time, and it's still calculating, and now we're going to go. But you're seeing we're still getting quite a lot of splotchiness. And this is where the next slider comes in. The next one's called smoothing, and this basically blends the samples and tries to blur the samples in a way before it renders so that we get a smoother result. We don't see all these little dots. So let's just turn up the smoothing to, I don't know, 50%. Do another render, and you can see we're chugging along here, and we're waiting, and there it goes. So now our render times significantly dropped, but now we're not getting that splotchiness anymore, which means we can actually zoom out here. Let's get a nice little angle, hit render, and hopefully get a similar result to the 100%, but in a lower form. And this really will work with still images. If you're rendering animation with subsurface scattering, you may have to turn that density up a little bit just to get a stable result over time. But if you're doing kind of a still and it's taking too long, you can kind of adjust these things. So now look, we have a similar result, and it's much lower. I'm going to flip back to the physical render just so we could render much quicker. Again, let's go ahead and hit render. You can see it starts right away, and we get an almost identical result at much a quicker time with subsurface scattering. So keep that in mind. Now the last one that seems to speed things up a little bit as well is turning up the threshold. So if you up the threshold here, hit render, you're also going to get a much faster time. And so let's kind of leave things as they are. Let's turn these up a little bit. Now that we're back in the physical render, we could probably turn up our sample density. Let's try 50% and turn down our smoothing to 20 or so. And in this way, we're kind of doing a half sample rate as far as the density, and then smoothing those out a little bit to try to speed everything up. All right, let's head back to the shader and talk about the rest of the path length settings. And if we open this up, you're going to see a red and a green and a blue set to 100%. And what this means is that the red, the green, and the blue are all going to dissipate at the same exact time, and that's 100%, which in this case is 1 centimeter. So after 1 centimeter, let's move this up to 2 centimeters and do a render. You're going to see it's a little bit brighter. And basically, after 2 centimeters, the light stops filtering through the object. In other words, it stops going through, and it just kind of it fades out after 2 centimeters. Now, if we turn one of these up, if we turn up green to, let's say, 600, 700% and do a render, you're going to see now we have this green light that's filtering through much further than all the other ones. So the other two colors of light, the red and the blue channels, basically are ending after 2 centimeters, but the green channel is actually going through much further. And this is very handy when you're talking about specific objects. So if we go through these presets here, if we go to ketchup, let's say, you could see ketchup, when we do a render, is set to a red value of 500%, and the green and blue values are very small. So now we have this really densely kind of packed thing, but as the filtering goes through, we have this kind of dark ketchup-y, syrupy thing. So let's go to the lit side of the dragon and do a render, and you can see now what we have is essentially a normal looking render on this side, but when you go to this side here, and do a render, you're going to see that it's the red channel that's kind of filtering through. And if we turn this up a little bit, if we turn the path length up, let's go to 4 centimeters and do another render, you're going to see the light come through even more. And it's really subtle here. I'm hoping you're seeing the detail, but it's coming through the mouth. Let's just turn this up just so you can make sure we're seeing the result in the video. So I just doubled it. There we go. So now we have this light, kind of bright red, blood red coming through just like a ketchup would, and that's because this red channel is much higher. Okay, so let's undo this, go back to our settings. For us, we have this orange channel, or we have the orange color, we have a low path length, and then we have everything set to 100. And something to keep in mind is that these are related. So if you turn the path length to 5, then that means the red, the green, and the blue all go to 5 centimeters all at once, right? So they all grow as this number grows. So in other words, if we leave this at 5, if we take the path length, so take a look at this render and what it looks like. If we half the path length to 2.5, and we double red, and I'm just going to tab green and blue to 200%, we double these and half this, then our render will be identical. And that's because those are related, right? So if the overall path length is 2.5 and we double it with red, green, and blue, that's essentially 5. And if we undo that and go back to 5, and then 100, 100, 100, we're again going to get the same render. So keep in mind, this is all relative to this number, okay? So from here, what we could do, let's make our standard color like a gray, like a middle white gray. So now we can really see the results of our path length. So let's lower our path length down to, like, let's say 2 centimeters. Now it's only coming through in certain areas, but again, let's turn the blue way up. Do a render, and you're going to see the blue is coming through really strong. And if that's too strong, we could turn it down. And now we're just getting kind of a faint blue. And now we can blend these colors together. We can get a little bit of green and then some blue. And now we have like almost like a turquoise, and it's really bright, and it's really kind of see-through, waxy, fleshy kind of coloring. And we get some really cool results. So play around with that. What you want to be careful about is when your path length is too high. So let's just set this to 10 and see what happens. When we go too high, it all becomes kind of a similar color. Nothing is fading out too deep, and you're losing a lot of detail. Now 10 actually isn't so bad, but let's start to go to like 20, do another render, and basically it's just a flat luminance. There's not a lot of detail in that render, and in some cases this will be helpful, and we could look into that more, but you want to be careful. You want to start low is basically what I'm saying. Start low and then move up if you need to. So I'm going to keep this around here. Now, what's nice, another nice thing about the new subsurface scattering is that it does work with global illumination. The original kind of traditional subsurface scattering module, I guess you would call it, or shader, would not work with global illumination. In other words, you needed a real light in the scene, like a real, like a 3D light, in order to cast the shadowing and do all that properly for the global illumination, or for the subsurface scattering. No more. The subsurface scattering actually now works with HDR domes. So let me show you that really quickly. We can, let me just build a quick dome. We have this HDRI Studio Pack. We can pick a studio rig, and then in the rig we could put a, let's just put the standard studio here. And now for this, let's just turn off our softbox. And for this, what we could do, go into render settings, we have physical on, and we have indirect illumination on. This is the global illumination for the physical render. Let's go back out and do a render and see what happens. So now you're seeing it's a little bit bright. we have our settings cranked on our global illumination. So let's just turn it down from 300. And that's much better. So now you can see we're actually getting subsurface scattering from our dome here. So we have some kind of HDR lights that are lighting. We have a blue kind of light over here. And this is all being filtered in to our object through global illumination. So, for example, if we, I knocked the numbers down. Let's make this 100% again and do another render. Perfect. So now if we change our HDR image to something, let's say, more directional, have these single lights that we could throw in the rig here. So let's just throw like a softbox. And now we just have this one softbox that's hitting the object from the right. And this actually looks really similar to this softbox. But it's coming from an HDR image, which means we can actually rotate this around, let's say around to the other side. There we go. And now it's kind of off to the left, or I'm sorry, off to the right of our camera. And now we're getting light on the other side. So this is really nice because we can now use subsurface scattering with global illumination with HDR domes as well and get these really nice results. So where can we go from here? Where can we take this model if we were to finish it? How do we kind of get to the final result now that we know how to use subsurface scattering? How do we use this to our advantage, I guess, to make like this really kind of waxy, fun little like a toy. I'm imagining if you've ever been to the museum, they have those little stamp out, dinosaurs and stuff they build out of little plastics, and they're kind of hollow. That's kind of the look I was going for this type of thing. And obviously we don't have that right now. Right now it looks like this is made from like a rubber, just like thick rubber and molded. So what can we do to start to make this look a little more realistic? Well, let's get rid of our HDR and turn off global illumination for now, and just concentrate on using some soft boxes and some reflections to start to get our dragon looking good. So first thing we need is another light. This backlight here was nice for the tutorial, but we're missing all this detail around this side and also in the face. So let's go into our material, and first of all, let's turn the color channel back on, and let's start to color our object. So we have a little bit of a blue kind of shell, and then our luminance in our subsurface scattering, we could also make maybe like a, not too strong of a blue, but more of like a faded gray blue. And that'll be our luminance color. If we do a render now, we have this really nice blue, and the light's starting to come through. And let's check our subsurface scattering and turn it down. Let's start with 2 centimeters at first, and then we'll move up if we need to. So that's looking pretty good. Let's look at the path length, and I think that we definitely want some coloring to happen. I don't want this all to be blue straight through. Maybe the red channel actually fades through a little bit further, and that looks pretty good. We're going to get a better idea once we add more lights. So the first thing we could do is turn up our softbox. So let's go ahead and just turn this up. We're getting a lot more kind of rear lit subsurface scattering. If we duplicate our softbox and rotate it around, we can now have kind of 2 light sources coming at it from both sides. We get these really nice reflections. We get really nice shadowing going on here. And of course, these reflections are mainly coming from this specular. And the specular reflections just don't do this justice. What we really are going to do is come in here and add some blurry reflections. So let's go ahead and turn on reflection and go add a Fresnel shader and turn both of these way down. In our reflection channel, we have basically the overall brightness of the reflection and then the Fresnel shading, which is going to give us a more realistic fall off. So I'm going to lower both of these. We don't really want too strong of reflections, but let's do a render and see what we have now is a very glossy kind of reflections here. And what we need to do is blur them. So right here in blurriness, we can, let's say to go to 15%. Let's do a render now. And because we're using the physical render and because we're already in the physical render kind of mode, the blurry reflections don't take as long as they would with the standard renderer. Really adding blurry reflections at this point don't up the render time too much. So we can really crank this and we're not going to see a ton of render hit on this. So now we have this really nice waxy look on our reflections. We have our dragon. And I think what we may be missing now are just a little bit of shadowing. Sometimes with subsurface scattering coming through too far, you're going to lose some nice shadowing like in the details. And that's where we can come in and add ambient occlusion. And let's just leave it on by default and see what happens. You're going to see ambient occlusion is going to come in and start to add a little bit more detail in the mouth, in the eyeballs here, and it's going to give us more detail in these shadows. And that's already looking better. So from here, what can we do? This blue seems a little pale to me, so let's go into our luminance and kind of crank up the bluiness. And we're also going to use the active render region, or the interactive render region, I think they call it. And I added this by hitting Option R or Alt R, and what this is going to do is kind of continuously render as I tweak stuff. So now if I come in here and make this green, you're going to see it'll update right away in our viewport. And as we tweak our blue color here, you're going to just wait a second and it'll pop into blue, and that's looking nice. Nice rich blue. And what I want is the filtering of the light to kind of come through as a red. And what I'd really like to do is see kind of a red come through the tummy here. See how dark it is down there? But if I come to path length and I crank up on the red, we're hopefully going to see a little bit more light creep through. So let's turn up the numbers first. And you're seeing that start to creep in right down there. And we can even make this higher than 1000%. And we're starting to get this nice red kind of purplish color when it's blending the red and the blue together here in the tummy. So if we turn that back down, you're going to see it kind of fade off. See how dark it gets? If we turn this up, let's even double it. Let's go to 2000% on the red and really let some red through. You can see now we have this nice purpley kind of red that's coming through right there. And from here, what's nice with a lot, I mean, I do this with a lot of things, but with subsurface scattering, you can actually crank things up and way down and really get a dramatic result. So now I just doubled it. And now we have this really kind of waxy, cartoony feel. The redness is really coming through in the mouth and the tummy there, and even maybe a little bit too much. So we can turn that down and have it not so brightly pink, but we're getting some really nice effects. In fact, I like that red effect so much, what I might do is turn down this secondary softbox so it's not lighting this side of the character so much. So let's turn that down. And now we're seeing this red coming through. I think I turned it down a little bit too much. Yeah, well, maybe not. I do like the reflections. Maybe what we'll do is we'll turn it down, but turn our reflections up. I think it was the reflections that I liked, having that light so bright. So all we have to do is go to our reflection channel here, and I'm going to turn up the Fresnel on the reflections, and we can see it right away in the viewport. Our reflections get a lot hotter. We could even add a little bit more. And our blurry reflections are just getting a little bit whiter, a little bit brighter. It's getting a little bright on this side, but I think that's okay. I think if we find the right camera angle, we can kind of use this nice rim light to our advantage. So let's do a full res render here in the viewport and see where we are. The progressive render is going to start chugging away on it, and we get some really nice details here. and I think things are looking pretty good. Let's add one more light to the scene, and this is going to be the one that'll light the background. Sometimes you want to light the background separately, and while you can add a light and just apply it only to the background using let's say a compositing tag, in a normal studio situation, you don't have that luxury. And sometimes it's nice to play around with some constraints in 3D, and you'll get a lot of times a much more realistic render. So let's add that. Let's go to our content browser. I'm going to use a overhead softbox, which is part of the Grayscale Gorilla Light Kit. If you don't have that, you can actually use the lights here. There's an area light that won't give you the reflections, but it will give you some of the similar shadowing. We're going to use the overhead light box. I'm going to turn off the interactive render region. We're going to go to the overhead softbox, and we're going to zoom out. So let's set a camera here just so we can come back to it. But now I'm going to zoom out. You're going to see we have this overhead softbox that's kind of up in the air, and this is all we want this to do is light the background. So what we can do is grab it, and first of all, we need to rotate it. See, it's a little off axis to our whole rig here. So let's just grab the green and rotate this around. That's close enough. And then we'll aim it toward the backdrop. Okay. Now what we can do is come over to the side and grab our kind of arrows here and position it so it's not really affecting our object, but only affecting the background. So what we could do is come into the espresso of our box and kind of shrink it. So now it's only going to be on the backdrop. And it's kind of overhead too on the backdrop. Let's move back here and see what we have. Let's see what it's affecting. You can see we have much more light back here. And if we turn this up, that's the scale. If we turn up the brightness, you're going to see it's mainly going to affect the background and just give us more of a kind of base to work with. One other thing we don't want are these in the render. So we can go to our softbox. I'm going to select them both, go into softbox controls, and turn off scene by camera. And now when we do a render, those will be gone. Those will be out of the scene, and it's only the backdrop. Now we just need to fill out the backdrop a little bit. So let's just grab it and scale it. There we go. And you can see we just filled in that corner. Now when we do a render, it's going to kind of do the whole thing there. Now, this line is bothering me a little bit. But what I think is really bothering me is this is just too bright. I just wanted a little bit of color and a little bit of kick from this overhead softbox. So let's turn it back down, and then let's add a little bit of color. Let's add just a little bit of blue in the render itself, and it's going to kind of sit it in the scene a little bit. And in fact, I think we could add a little bit of blue to our rear light as well. Back here, I think just a hint will help it. And then we're going to add a little bit of warmth to this light just to kind of offset it a little bit. So we're going to pick a little bit of warmth on the front and blue on the back, and that's just going to give a little bit more balance to our scene. You can see we have a little bit of amber color here and a little bit of blue shadowing. I think it adds a little bit more depth. So that's looking pretty good to me. Now from here, what we could do is we could add depth of field effects. We could add a bunch of stuff. So let's just go ahead and add, if you've seen my depth of field tutorial, you can go follow that if you want to really follow along. But I'll just show you really quickly how we could set this up. We can go to our physical render, turn on depth of field, go to our camera settings, and then I'm going to just turn off our camera and go here. And basically, I want to make sure our camera is focused on the face of our dragon, and then the blurriness is going to kind of go back through the back end here. So I could grab the focus distance and kind of reduce it, or I can also grab the center point right there on the focus distance and manually kind of drag it. And that's how I'm going to do this here. I'm just going to move it, drag it, so it's right on the eyeballs of our dragon here. And that looks great. Let's go back to our camera. Let's hit render. And you can see we have really subtle depth of field. And what we can do to turn that up is go to our f-stop and basically lower it. And by lowering the f-stop, you're making the lens larger and the iris of the lens larger, and you're allowing more of that blurriness to come through. What's nice is if we're not getting enough here, there's a few things we could do. One is adjust the scaling of our scene. So right now, by default, we're using centimeters. If we were to go to a smaller scale, like a millimeter or something smaller, our depth of field is going to go way more, just because if we're focused in really tight on objects like that, if you've ever seen like macro photography, it's going to be more blurriness, in other words. But we can also kind of trick it here by going lower than 1 and going to something like 0.2 here. Now you're seeing we're getting this nice depth of field effect, and the progressive renderer is going to kind of chug on this and refine it. Right now it's maybe a little bit grainy, but as we let it sit here over time, you're going to see it get nicer and nicer and nicer, and we can basically stop it when it looks good enough for us. And that's pretty much how I set this scene up. And when I got here, a lot of what I did after this was just playing with some of the subsurface scattering. So once you get to this scene, once you have it all set up and you have some nice lighting you're happy with, go back into the subsurface scattering and start to play with the results. You know, double, triple the amount, or turn it down, turn it up. Play with the path length and try to get different kind of flavors. Turn off the color channel and see what that does. See what kind of waxiness that gives you. You still got some reflections here. We have this really waxy kind of feel. If we turn off our color channel, it's a lot. There's kind of no shell. It's a real rubber looking object there. Play around with the lights. See how those affect, because now the lighting isn't just being affected by the back side, it's actually being affected by both sides, because we have a light over here and a light over here, and they're both coming at it and making the light bounce around from within this object and giving this really, really bright kind of feeling. And just to show you, just to be sure, let's turn off our subsurface scattering and see what this would look like without subsurface scattering. You can see now all of that nice brightness and all of that nice kind of waxiness exists in that luminance channel. And now without it, it's just this hard plastic edge, you know, not even plastic. It's just this real kind of hard object with no kind of scale to it, and there's no sense of kind of depth in there. And by turning on that luminance, by playing around with subsurface scattering, I think you'll find some really, really nice results for it. So that's it. That is hopefully a pretty good look into subsurface scattering and how to start to use it in your scene, and especially the new version of in R13. It renders much more realistically with much less time, I think, as well. It's a little bit quicker, especially if you're using the new physical renderer. If you haven't seen that video before where I show you the difference, I have a comparison between the two, and the physical render really kills it when it comes to the blurry reflections and the subsurface scattering. So hopefully that's it there. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you in another video and another tutorial really soon. Thanks as always for watching. Bye, everybody.